This book was reminding me as I was reading it a lot of grad school and the things that I was assigned in grad school. And in fact, recently I moved offices and I had a smaller bookshelf in my new office, so I actually had to clear out a lot of my old books. And I was reading Western Marxism as I was doing it, and making a very conscious decision about what I was going to keep and what I was going to get rid of. And this actually helped get rid of a lot of it, because there was a lot of frustrations I had, in grad school. And and I don't want to turn this interview into a grad seminar, because I want people to kind of be excited about this, and really, take something away that they might not, if they're not in grad school, or they're not in the university. But before we get into that, maybe you can just talk a little bit about yourself, Gabriel, and where you're calling from, but also what was your role in getting this book published?
Hi, everyone. This is Melanie Yazzie from Red Power Hour. This Native American Heritage Month, please consider empowering Red Media. Indigenous Peoples Day 2024 marks the 5th anniversary of the Red Nation podcast. Our podcast is a collaboration between the Red Nation and Red Media and is produced by Red Media. Red Media exists to fill the need for Indigenous media by and for Indigenous people. We are launching a GoFundMe campaign to gain support for our operational costs. Please consider empowering Red Media's work. You can also continue to support Red Media on Patreon, where you will gain access to bonus episodes of the Red Nation podcast, Red Power Hour, and many more benefits. Your support empowers Indigenous media and our podcasts. Thank you so much. Ahiahet.
Yeah, as far as myself, I come from rural Kansas and grew up on a farm and got really interested in intellectual work as respite from the toil of manual labor, and then went to college and was exposed to French theory, Western Marxism, things like this, and went and studied in France. I spent well over a decade there, and was just constantly looking for radical theory that had use value to making, changing the world, not just interpreting it. And I encountered Losurdo's work, I don't know, it must be well over a decade ago. And then in reading everything that I could in all the languages that I know, I recognized clearly that so much of his work is not available in English. And so Western Marxism really resonated with me in part because I'm currently completing a trilogy for Monthly Review Press called The Intellectual World War, Marxism versus the Imperial Theory Industry. It really examines the history of the imperial theory industry, the forces driving it, both state forces, capitalist forces, etc. And when I read the book, I had both a sense of confirmation that a lot of the things that I had been thinking were validated by someone who's an intellectual who I greatly esteem. But then also, I've always appreciated Losurdo has incredible, I think, rhetorical abilities and scholarly finesse. And so he always weaves together intellectual work with the global history of class struggle. So you're never reading books in isolation, or there's not intellectuals who are just having conversations in their minds or with other intellectuals. He's always saying, well, this is what an intellectual said. Isn't it interesting that it was during the time the Nazis were invading the Soviet Union, for instance? And doesn't that shed light on the practical implications of what they're doing? And so that was really one of the motivations for bringing this book to the English-speaking world. And now, in fact, it's kind of blown up quite quickly. So there's a number of other projects that are in the works that are forthcoming books from Losurdo.
Yeah, that's really exciting. So you're writing a trilogy for Monthly Review Press.
Yeah, it started actually just as a book, but it's been a long time coming because a lot of it came out of research into the role of the capitalist ruling class and their state managers in promoting forms of compatible theory as radical. And this includes Western Marxism, but it also includes French theory and, in many ways, the traditions of kind of radical theoretical work that grew out of these traditions. So you could look at liberal queer theory, Afro-pessimism, decolonial theory, post-colonial theory, and almost all of them trace their roots back to these movements. And so I'm interested in, and more than interested, because now the first volume is complete and in press, have been invested in developing a political economy of knowledge production, looking at knowledge not from the point of view of what individuals are doing on their own, or even small communities or schools or movements, but what are the real socioeconomic forces driving intellectual production and then disseminating that intellectual production internationally. And that's really at the core of this particular project. And one of the things that you see very clearly, just quickly on this, is that the type of theory that's promoted is, of course, the type of theory that is not supportive of anti-colonial, anti-imperialist movements, and that does not have use value for real struggles on the ground. And so part of this is a diagnosis of my own miseducation or inculcation within prestigious universities that peddle in this type of work. And I think it's urgent, given the state of the world, that this is recognized, but also that it's always framed within a broader positive project, right? So the goal isn't just to criticize these authors or to recognize that they were complicit with imperialism. The goal is to get on the right track with an anti-imperialist, pro-socialist orientation. And there's a lot of very important work to be done on that front.
Yeah, that sounds like a really amazing project, and we'll probably have you on when you finish. Yeah, because this is something for me. Like, it's just, my mom was a teacher, and so like the first and primary skill that I gained was reading, and I've just read a lot. As somebody who went to public libraries, we didn't have enough money to really afford cable, so it was just kind of like I just read a lot. And I was reading like Noam Chomsky in high school, in a town of 2,100 people. I had nobody to talk to. So a lot of the things that, I didn't have anybody to share these ideas with. And it's like, I opposed the war, but no, it's like, how do you have an anti-war movement in a town of 2,100 people? That's very kind of rural, conservative, and also you're the racialized minority within that town. But, this coming to the academy was quite a process for me. I mean, just in general, like Native people, I think the year that I graduated high school, we had a dropout rate of like over 75% across the state in South Dakota. And then I saw a statistic when I entered my graduate school and master's in history, that Native men specifically, like I think it's like they represent like half a percentage in terms of like people who pursue graduate education. Of course, those numbers have changed a little bit, but also haven't. And so accessing education, from my class background, but also where I come from, it was just not something that that people did. And so when I came to the academy, and I'm just giving a little biography about myself, I didn't actually come to be, I actually went into the hard sciences, and I kind of came to history and the humanities by accident, mostly because I had a really awful history professor. That's a whole long story. And he's like, if he can do it, I can do it, kind of thing. Anyways, I went to graduate school, and I remember being assigned texts that I had read outside of graduate school because I was involved in the anti-war movement against, the invasion of Iraq and the war on terror. I was in high school when 9/11 happened. So that was like a very kind of political moment for me, but I got radicalized in that. And I was reading, I had read Marx. I hadn't really read a whole lot of Lenin. I read some Engels, and it made sense in the context, in the milieu, the organizing milieu that I was a part of. But when I got into the academy, I was taking a class on Marxism. It's called Marxism. Well, I won't name it because I don't want to out the professor, but we were reading Marx, and I was, there was a question about like, students were like, going through this like labor theory of value, and they're like, what's the point of all this? And it's like, well, he kind of makes it clear. He's like, we need a communist revolution, and like we have to organize as workers. We don't have class consciousness, all these things. And the professor said, Nick, Marxism is not a blunt weapon. And I was like kind of taken back, because I was like, well, if you look at history, it kind of is a blunt weapon. It had to be. And more, the more I kind of advanced in graduate school, the more kind of disillusioned I got with the theory industry, and kind of reverted back to some of my old, I guess, disciplinary predilections as a historian, to be like, oh, I'm just going to go look in the archives because I can't handle theory right now. But those feelings I've always kind of kept. And this book, and I think your introduction in many ways kind of spells it out, because you're talking about the creation of an intellectual class of people within the global north, and specifically within the Western Academy. And you said something that's really fascinating too, about how you talk about labor aristocracy, and I would like you to kind of define that, but then also how you talk about the attempt by the petty bourgeoisie not to get proletarianized, not to get incorporated back into the working class, but also to kind of aspire to be the big bourgeoisie, or the part of the major ruling class. And why that's important, because we talk a lot about like standpoint theory and positionality, but never do we talk about class positions, because class positions are fundamentally about power. So maybe you can elaborate a little bit on that, and like why it's important to understand this intellectual project.
What you said at the beginning really resonated with me. If I could just pick up on it quickly and then address the question, and that is that a lot of the Western Marxism, or the academic radical theory that's taught in universities, one of the purposes that it serves, and it sounds like that it had that effect on you, and it certainly had that effect on me, is that it alienates working people, because it is a kind of fancy, sophisticated, complicated theory that's supposed to be disconnected from class struggle. And so I think that's part of its ideological function overall. And in many ways, I had a similar trajectory insofar as I didn't think of myself as a Marxist for a very long time, because I was reading Western Marxism and I thought to myself, well, I don't identify with this really loose, kind of politically disconnected defeatism. I want something with real teeth and that is scientifically rigorous. And so I also went into the historical social sciences as a way of finding tools that at least were engaged in materialist analysis, even if they were slightly less theoretical. And it's just an interesting kind of parallel that I was thinking of when you were sharing about your own biography. Regarding the labor aristocracy, of course, this comes out of Engels and Lenin, who recognized that the history of capitalist development has been imperialist in nature, and so it has underdeveloped the overwhelming majority of the world in order to develop the imperialist core, and more specifically, line the pockets of the imperial ruling class. And in doing so, then the history of capitalism has created global class stratification, such that the workers in the imperial core are situated at the top of global labor pyramids. And that is important to know, because it goes a long way to explaining why it is that a lot of the orientation of even the working class within the imperial core tends to be aligned on or supportive of capitalism and imperialism in ways that you usually don't find as extensively within the global south. And of course, one of the clearest proofs thereof is that we've had socialist state building projects and socialist revolutions across the global south. We haven't had them in the global north. And of course, Lenin diagnosed this very, very clearly. The intellectual labor aristocracy is a term that me and Jennifer, who co-authored the introduction to the book by Losurdo, use in order to index the specificity of what the class configuration of intellectuals within the imperial core is. And so very broadly, it's indexing the way in which, if you are a professor in the US Academy, for instance, you are situated not only above the overwhelming majority of professors in the world due to the history of imperialism, but also above all of the grad student labor pools, all of the adjunct labor pools, which are massive, etc. But it is true within the intellectual labor aristocracy, the people who are the real focal point for this criticism are those who are the creme de la creme of the intellectual labor aristocracy, right? So a professor like myself, or professors who are working at universities who have, middle-class salaries by US standards, are not at all like the kind of superpower titans of the theory industry who have access to literally millions of dollars for their projects in various ways. If it's through grants, if it's through governmental support, it's through junkets, publication options, and things like this. And one of the things that's important to recognize is that the Western Marxists, for the most part, and I would say more generally, just the radical theorists who are the most prominent, are part of this creme de la creme of the intellectual labor aristocracy. And so they do not actually have any real material interest in changing the world that promotes them. And on the contrary, what they tend to be oriented towards, if they're on the left, because plenty of them are on the right, but if they're on the left, then they want to appear as if they're on the side of popular struggles and struggles from below. And so there's a long-standing history of using the symbolism of revolutionary politics in order as cover for a lack of substance. And that's what you see, unfortunately, in a lot of the kind of radical liberal theoretical production in the imperial core. That's a massive industry at this point in time. It really, I think, dominates so much of the Western left intelligentsia. And it's also, there are mechanisms of cultural imperialism such that movements like, if it be liberal queer theory, Afro-pessimism, decolonial theory, these have enormous consequences globally, because then the kind of comprador intellectual labor aristocracy in the periphery is often playing to empire and wanting to connect to these prominent intellectuals in the imperial core because it leverages up their symbolic and their economic standing within their own local context.
Yeah, I think that's a really great sort of way to position these intellectuals within the context of this book. And I have a bigger kind of question that you can answer it in any other way, in any way that you want to, just because the title of the book is called Western Marxism. And I guess, like, what is Losurdo's definition of this, and why is it important to distinguish it as this kind of discrete field or discourse, in kind of contrast to, like, maybe Marxism in general, or like a global kind of proletariat kind of struggle?
It's a good question, because there has already been quite a bit of debate around the title and whether or not the title is really appropriate, because in a certain sense, and maybe this is one of the things you're alluding to, what Losurdo is giving us is a kind of diagnosis of the Western left intelligentsia, because many of the figures that he's critical of, Foucault comes to mind, or Hart and Negri, or people like this, they have been explicitly anti-Marxist. In fact, one of Foucault's main biographers refers to him as a violent anti-communist. And so that's just a kind of general statement. But what really I think Losurdo is doing in this book is he was intervening in a debate that was very prevalent within the European context due to the publications, Perry Anderson's publications in the 1980s on Western Marxism. And what he wanted to bring to the fore is the way in which Marxism is a universal project, both theoretically, scientifically on the one hand, but also, of course, then practically. But due to the impact of the imperial core and some of the perversions of the imperial core that I was just referencing, Marxism has been transformed by the, what we could really refer to as the intellectuals of empire. And meaning the intellectuals who have made primarily their careers within the imperial superstructure, within the imperial system of knowledge production, and who have then played to those forces in various ways. So I see Losurdo's understanding of Western Marxism as a perversion of the universal project of Marxist liberation, and very specifically the anti-colonial project, because across Losurdo's work, the way that class struggle has played itself out in the real world is national struggle. It's a struggle for national liberation from imperialism. And in that sense, then, the Western Marxists are the anti-imperialist Marxists. They're the ones who are opposed to those who would, as to reference your former professor, would want to use Marxist theory as a blunt weapon, meaning as a weapon of real class struggle that sometimes has to be simplified or has to be at least connected to organic, class struggles on the ground in various ways. And so it doesn't usually come with the perfume of French theory or the unbelievable, sophistication of the literary prose of an Adorno because it's supposed to be useful for real people. Does that help, or were you thinking about something more specific? Because he doesn't,
No.
at the end of the day, he doesn't just give us one
Yeah.
definition
Yeah.
of Western
Exactly.
Marxism, and you could point to that as a bit of a limitation in the book. But I think he's kind of giving us he's diagnosing all of these particular positions and trying to tease out of them a general pattern
Right.
of Marxism basically becoming aligned on an anti-imperialist orientation. That's the core problem I see with Western Marxism from Losurdo's vantage point.
Yeah, he does this in his other work. Like, it's kind of like he takes like a topic. Well, the big topic is Western Marxism, but he kind of takes these subsets of like the state, or he'll look at like biopolitics, and he's like, what are they actually saying about this? Or racism? How do they define racism? They completely, as you point out, occlude or exclude colonialism and imperialism from those analyses, which I think is incredibly like it's obvious to the point where it's like some people would say, oh, that's just a blunt criticism. But when you're reading it, you're sitting there thinking, like, I remember reading Foucault, and he was talking about the history of racism. And I don't even know, like, I took French history in French, and so I should know these figures, but I didn't know what the hell he was talking about. It was so particular because it's like, when you like just walk around in France and like you can see the history of racism, and it's not internal, it's completely external, in terms of how they talk about specifically Arab people and the people from their former colonies. You have to look at just the Vietnam struggle for liberation to understand the violence of that kind of racism. It's not nuanced. It's not internal, like in the sense that it arose from this obscure history or this obscure practice of state formation as Foucault defined it. But I also just want to, look at also, one thing that kind of brought up in my mind too, is because a lot of these figures have been taken up within, what can broadly be conceived as like post-colonial theory. He doesn't really get into this. But it helped me kind of think about this kind of strand of anti-communism within, I would say, indigenous studies, but then kind of other sort of fields, because it's pulling from these figures. And I think the biggest, one of the biggest ones is like you have critiques of the state, for example. And it's like the state becomes the ultimate and penultimate evil, which is somewhat understandable as from a knee-jerk position from like the perspective of a native person, because the state has been constructed as a settler state to replace. But then looking from the anti-colonial world, it was about state construction and development, terms that within these kind of post-colonial theories are considered bad terms, state power and development specifically. But when you read these non-Western Marxists, I can think of like Walter Rodney, for example, when he says the underdevelopment of Africa, he's not talking about, he's talking about like people, every group of people has the right to be on a kind of path towards development. And colonialism and imperialism have knocked those people off that path. It doesn't mean that people are trying to revert back to some kind of imagined past to like, that never existed. But I think that in some ways, like the post-colonial theory and even some kind of some forms of indigenismo that's come out of Latin America has put native people within a sort of time capsule to say that this is where they should stay, and that they shouldn't, they're not part of communist movements, they're not part of Marxist struggles. But if you go back and look, one of the most fascinating things to me was going to southern Venezuela, where you had indigenous people who were spouting off, Chavista slogans and programs and calling themselves Chavistas, right? And talking about the state and the Constitution and how it enshrined indigenous rights and protected, their medicinal practices, and had set aside territory, for them that they never had. And that doesn't gel with the kind of theory industry that's supposed to be, the state is always going to be colonial and it's always bad. And it neglects and it purposefully silences people who are actually in a state building project. They're not, of course, they're they have criticisms. Everyone has criticisms, and that you shouldn't always have to point that out. But it's a struggle. It's not something that appears overnight. And I think that question of the state is so central to a lot of this this sort of social chauvinism, specifically because they'll point to Lenin. It's like, yeah, State and Revolution. He talks about the withering of the way of the state, but he was also writing in the midst of a revolution. He never finished the book, and it's a good book, but it's not, the end result. If the end result is utopia, then you don't have a firm grasp of reality as it exists, and sort of understanding the forces that are aligned against these state projects. And I'll just say one thing, and I would like to get your thoughts on this, because I think his book State and Revolution really opened, or not State and Revolution, War and Revolution, Losurdo's War and Revolution opened up this thinking for me. But I think at the heart of a lot of this this question around Western Marxism and its reactionary and chauvinistic nature really comes from a miseducation around World War II and the Nazi project, specifically because Nazism was seen as sort of an aberrant kind of phenomenon out of Europe, but and that becomes the sort of the ultimate evil in terms of like, this is the outcome. It doesn't, it's completely seen as like a deviation from liberalism and liberal democracy. But when you go back, and you can even read Raphael Lemkin, he employs a colonial analysis to understand why and how effective the Nazi genocide against, not just Jewish people, but specifically racialized other people who were considered indigenous to Eastern Europe, but also communists. Those were all conflated within one. But when we think about World War II and the Holocaust, we don't think of Nazism as something that's like this kind of genocidal Orientalist project, which it was. It was going specific. It was moving east for a reason. And I would like, maybe if you could like kind of flesh out some of those ideas a little bit to understand why these intellectuals at this time, especially like people like Hannah Arendt, who were looking at World War II, but also using this term called totalitarianism to conflate the Soviet state building project with sort of Nazi Germany, and why that was such a effective kind of project of propaganda to delegitimize other, actually existing socialist states or projects.
Yeah, there's a lot in what you said. Maybe I'll just start by picking up on the fact that for Losurdo, it's absolutely true that if you are going to fight and win, not have the dignity of fighting and failing, and you're doing that in an imperialist world, and there isn't a single socialist project that hasn't been under siege by imperialism, it means that you're going to have to get state power, and you're going to have to figure out how to hold on to it. And the proof thereof isn't that Losurdo said it. The proof thereof is material history. And that the Nazi genocidal rampage, which we should never forget, was very explicitly modeled on the US-American genocidal rampage against the indigenous population. The wild, wild west to the United States was the wild, wild east to the Nazi regime. That is the type of violence that we're talking about. So you don't need a small state. You need a strong and powerful state. And what occurred in the Soviet Union was a state that was capable of defeating the most powerful, genocidally oriented army in the history of the world. And in that regard, the flip side of that, which is what you were pointing out about the kind of anti-statism that you get in so much of the Western left intelligentsia, is a project of failure. It is literally like telling people the way, it's like, hopefully this analogy will work. It's like giving to indigenous populations in the United States guns that are broken and saying, these are your weapons of struggle. What's going to happen in that case is that they're going to get crushed, or they give them guns with no ammo and be like, go fight people who have ammo. You need a strong state to fight imperialist states. And one other aspect of this that I think is really important is that Losurdo, often in some of his other work, he defines socialism as a process of learning and a practical process of learning, right? It doesn't fall from the sky. It's not because it's in a book or there's a Bible to how this stuff is supposed to be done. It's people collectively figuring out how to break the chains of imperialism and build a socialist world that is environmentally oriented. And one of the major, major lessons in that history, and Lenin had to learn it, and Lenin did learn it, is that the state does not wither away. The state does not wither away in an imperialist world. It might very well, and it certainly will, take on a kind of administration of things as opposed to a state structure in some type of future. But in the imperialist world, you need a state to defend it, against imperialist states. And, another theme, Nick, that came up kind of in the early part of what you were saying that I think is really important is that another perversion of a lot of the Western left intelligentsia has to do with the very widespread promotion of identity politics and identitarian orientations as a kind of ideological war that you could date back basically to the kind of neoliberal phase of capitalist accumulation that consisted in saying, well, the primary struggle is the struggle around your identity, your categories, and representative and symbolic elements attached to those. So how people speak and how they dress and what they acknowledge or they don't. And granted, these things can be symbolically important. But if it's all symbol at the expense of class struggle and substance, then you successfully basically ally yourself on a project in which you accept the logic of being divided and conquered. And you defend your identitarian constituency rather than being invested in a collective project of socialist state building and anti-imperialism. And one of the things that you see, you referenced kind of post-colonial studies, indigenous studies, and other traditions like that. And of course, these are broad traditions. There are people who are still doing interesting work within them or who are conversant in them. So I don't mean to lump them all together and throw them out, but there's one thread that's very clear, and that is a kind of noble savage discourse that takes on very sophisticated forms at times, but basically amounts to celebrating versions of indigeneity or of local culture that consist in saying that, well, the real noble savage is the one who wouldn't support Chavismo, for instance, or wouldn't be invested in a state building project because they're not falling into the pattern of what the noble savage or what the indigenous is supposed to be, which is this, utopian dreamscape projected onto a past that maybe never even was, and then is supposed to be our imagined future. And so there's also just a lack of materialist analysis of what it means to be, be indigenous in the contemporary world, in the imperialist world as it currently functions. And I'm using indigenous in a very broad context, right? In referring to all of the indigenous peoples of the world and how their lives have been impacted by imperialism. And so maybe the last thing that I would say is that a lot of the Western left intelligentsia, it not only has, I think, an incorrect understanding of the material history of states, but it also has a really flattened understanding of power, because it basically wants to say that all power is bad. And what they tend to celebrate is struggles that fail. So if you would imagine that the struggle for Palestinian liberation would succeed because it would have its own state and that state might be socialistically oriented, there are many on the Western left who I think would withdraw in horror and say, oh, it's authoritarian and it's, top down and repressive and it's not democratic and other things like this. And so I think that's another thing, is really needing to understand that there's not just power in general, right? And that it's bad. There's people power, and there's the power of the capitalist ruling class and all of its managers and the many different forms that it takes. And so there are pernicious forms of power, but there's also collective power of resistance and building real democracies, and that we should support, just as there are states that, again, we can have various criticisms of them, but they empower people to have the value that they produce redirected towards them via socialism, and that we need to be able to support that and separate different forms of power and different forms of state in order to have a coherent politics and thus coherent actions in the world linked to that kind of theoretical framework, if you will.
Yeah, I think you're right about supporting the movements that fail. And it's like, if people are sympathetic to Lenin, they do not like what comes after Lenin, because then you get into the messy business of like actually building and defending your project. Or even in Venezuela, if you appreciate the Bolivarian Revolution, you might like um, Chavez, but you might not like Maduro. Like, oh, he's the betrayer. And it's that's such a simplistic way of thinking about it. Or even Mao and Deng Xiaoping. Like it's a very simplistic way of viewing the world. But in it, you were talking about this concept of indigeneity in this, and to me, I'm really reluctant to use that term anymore, just because I use it, obviously because it's how we have to communicate, but it's become emptied of so much meaning in the sense that the Azov battalion can deploy the notion of indigeneity in its decolonization effort against Russia, to expand NATO and to expand its like Nazi whatever project. Or the state of Israel can deploy the concept of indigeneity based on a couple of Bible passages, right? To say that they're the true indigenous people of Palestine, right? So to me, that's where the identity, because I have nothing in common with any of them, but also even the people am part of a nation or a tribe. There's class differentiation. I would say it's less than kind of the broader settler population in general, but still, it's like it ignores the question of class, because some people, are going to be. If you look at the U.S. Congress, for example, at one point in time, the six representatives that were in Congress, three of them were not just Republicans; they were like strident Trump Republicans, like hardcore right wingers. Like that is not. I have nothing in common, with them. Or do I have anything in common with the other three who sat on like the defense councils and were funding endless military spending? So this whole idea that somehow identity is this transhistorical thing, it falls flat on its face. The other thing that going back to the failure of revolutions, and I think of Losurdo doesn't talk about settler colonialism, and but I think about this in the context of how we're the genocide in Gaza and the resistance that's happening, and this kind of inability to really wrestle with what exactly you just said, like a post genocide Palestine, because if there's not outright condemnation of resistance as a form of self defense, then there's an inability to imagine, well, what do you do? Like, what do you do with, do you just perpetuate this kind of settler colonial system? And people like, there's just still this, we still have two staters. I don't know how you can have that position, because it's like, that's Israel's default position. This is the two-state solution enacting itself and carrying itself out. But you have somebody who, like Patrick Wolf, who've theorized settler colonialism, and in reality, like he doesn't own that concept, and I'm very critical for a lot of reasons. I think he's, I don't want to just throw his work entirely out, because if you go back, that concept was first theorized by Palestinians themselves, and back in the 60s, and we got it from them. We didn't theorize it and then put it on the Palestinian situation. It was through our international our international solidarity that we learned how to understand our situation as a settler colonial situation. But what's also kind of missing within the framework of Patrick Wolf's theorization and this broader kind of theory of settler colonial studies is that there's never been, this is one of the contentions, there's never been a successful overthrow of a settler colonial society. And I was just like kind of blown away, because as I told you, before I even heard the term settler colonialism, I studied in France, and I studied the Algerian Revolution in French, and it was like bloody. It's so violent, but it was a settler colonial project. And if you pay attention, if you're not so brainwormed by the propaganda that's put out there, and if you listen to what Palestinians are saying, they're saying this: we are using the Algerian model. It's not to valorize, the loss of life. It's not to say that, this is some kind of romantic struggle or this or that, but it's to understand that to unseat that kind of imperialist project requires immense, immense amount of loss of life and violence, and that settler colonialism has been overthrown. One could argue that this is also the case in Rhodesia, right? To overturn the Rhodesian government, and look where that project is today, and how it's viewed by the West in terms of it's a pariah state basically, and people say all kinds of things, but it was interesting reading this book to also read the descriptions of the immense amount of violence by Japanese colonialism and imperialism in China, and then to say that somehow, like, there's nothing in the Western conscious that remembers that kind of violence, or remembers the millions of people who died, like, outside of the theater of Europe in terms of the war. Instead, they place the violence on what came afterwards to undo and to bring those people out of those conditions, and that's like China. That's the big question that's like permeating my mind right now, because it's like, how did that project succeed? What is it doing? We can't even have those conversations without risking our own careers, our own credibility, in terms of talking just about alternatives, because it's been completely choked off. I'm kind of on a soapbox right now, so I'll ask a question. but but Frances Hasso, a friend of ours, and we had her on the show. She kind of had this theory. She gave a talk here in Toronto, and she was talking about how um, um, people who are engaged in resistance and anti-colonial resistance, especially on the left, are often kind of written off as like shills. Oh, you're just a shill for communism, and that you don't have any independent thought, and there's no dynamism, there's no sort of debate. But we never apply, and I think this is what Losurdo is doing in his critique of Western Marxism, that same kind of denunciation of intellectuals who become shills for empire. And I wonder, like, where does that leave us in terms of, if we're talking about this critique and this that he offers in this book. And for me, like, reading Heart and Negri, I remember when the book first came out and everyone's like, you have to read this book, and I was like, I got 2 pages in, I was like, I actually don't understand. Later on in grad school, I had to finish reading it, and that's like, wait, they think Thomas Jefferson had some really great things to say. I wish he would have got into that. He doesn't get into it in this, but okay. Yeah. But the question is like, what do we do with these thinkers and this intellectual tradition? I have a final question about like where he thinks Western Marxism is going, but I wanted to get your thoughts about, like, how do you, like, what is your citational practice, and when you talk about these thinkers, but also just how do you deal with it within your own work?
Well, yeah, I think that there's a clear way in which so many of the dominant thinkers within the imperial core, they are shills for empire. They, and very explicitly in certain cases. I mean, Slavoj Žižek has been supporting the U.S. proxy war in the Ukraine in the strongest possible terms, taking pro-imperialist, pro-European Union, pro-NATO positions, which are all quintessentially anti-leftist, let alone anti-Marxist. And he's only one. There are many others. Hart and Negri have taken positions that I take to be abhorrent on geopolitics. And it's interesting, too, that you relate that to, there is this sense that, well, on the socialist or communist left, that there's not much dynamism, and that there's just party apparatchiks who are marching like robots to, the will of their masters. If you actually study these material histories, of course, that's not at all the case. One of the things I was thinking about in one of the earlier comments that you made is all of the debates in Latin America around people like Mariátegui and others who are plugged into the Communist International around the indigenous question, around the national question, about what exactly, how the Third International would relate to struggles for national liberation across Latin America. These were not intellectuals or activists who were just marching like robots to the tune of Moscow. There were very rich, extremely important debates, and there were major innovations within them. And so I think that we also have to get beyond this really cartoonish image that's projected onto us of socialist or communist intellectuals somehow just being apparatchiks who are remote controlled or something like that. In fact, one of the interesting developments in contemporary Chinese Marxism is the School of Innovative Marxism. That's the title of it. That is its goal. It has internal debates, and it has very strong disagreements on certain fronts with the Chinese Communist Party leadership. And many people, you could also reference the Cubans, for instance, where a lot of their cultural institutions are autonomous from the state because they actually want to foster this type of intellectual and cultural autonomy, not because they believe in the kind of liberal autonomy of spheres that you get in the capitalist world, but because they think it's rich and important for people to have competing ideas, agendas, orientations, and that practically speaking, good things will come of that. So I just wanted to note that in passing. The other thing that I wanted to touch on is that one of the things that I think is the most helpful in Losurdo's framing of global history is an understanding that there is an appeal that is very ultra-leftist to the phase of revolution that is the political military phase, right? So a lot of people on the left would think, yeah, Che Guevara in the jungle, that's kind of cool, or whatever, they'd affiliate with that. When you're rising up, fighting power and ousting dictators, that's great, and we should support it. But then when you move into what Losurdo refers to as the economic phase of the revolution, and it is still the revolution, but it's a revolution that is focused on consolidating state power, educating the population, moving towards socialism, developing the productive forces, fighting off imperialism. These become kind of more bureaucratic tasks, not bureaucratic in the negative sense of this term, but they're tasks that require enormous state oversight and centralized power. And there's such a fetishization of the kind of military and political revolution at the expense of the long-term revolution of actually building power. And if we're serious about fighting and winning, not just dying on the barricades, then we have to recognize the long-term nature of revolutionary transformation, particularly in a world of ecological apocalypse, in which if we're going to get out of the quagmire that capitalism has put us in, we need long-term state-building projects of a socialist nature that move things in a different direction by developing the productive forces and by having centralized planning over the economy, the environment, and many, many other things. And that's absolutely essential. Maybe the last thing that I'd say is just on regarding some of your comments about settler colonialism. One of the things I really appreciate about Losurdo's work is that he demonstrates that, and many others have done this as well, colonialism isn't, it's not an accident. It's not the will of a few bad people. It is a structural and systemic aspect of capitalism. It is required by capitalism. And colonialism takes on a lot of different forms, right? It can be settler colonialism, other forms of colonialism, neo-colonialism, right? It takes on many, many different shapes and forms, but this is an ongoing project of underdeveloping the overwhelming majority of the planet in order to distribute wealth upward. And therefore, the real core, the beating heart of the Marxist project in the real world has been an anti-colonial project. That is what it is. And so if we see this very clearly, kind of echoing back to our opening conversation around Western Marxism, it's that the Western Marxists are saying, no, that's what people are doing in the colonies and the struggle against imperialism, the struggle against colonialism. They're very, very dismissive of that and often very supportive of imperialism. And so you see the kind of parting of ways between what he calls in the book Western Marxism on the one hand, or we can just call imperialist Marxism, or it's not even Marxism, right? It's an imperialist perversion that takes place within the Western intelligentsia and has an enormous impact on activist communities as well, versus what he calls Eastern Marxism. But really Eastern Marxism, what he's indexing is the state building projects in the Soviet Union, China, Korea, Vietnam, etc. But really, what he's talking about is the anti-imperialist state building projects that you also do see in places like Venezuela and Cuba, Nicaragua, and other places like that. And so that is the real polarization. And if people take one thing away from the book, it should be, well, am I on the side of this pseudo-sophisticated intellectual project of interpreting, and more precisely, misinterpreting the world, and I want to be a Western Marxist? Or am I on the side of anti-colonial struggle that is an innovative, very innovative, at the practical level? The innovation is incredible. A very innovative, creative project of doing the impossible, which is defeating imperialism and building a new socialist world through state projects. And that is the real kind of crossroads that we're faced with in a book like this. And so it should also excite people, not simply get them kind of demoralized by how they've been exposed to Western theory. They should be excited about the very rich, broad, and ongoing innovative tradition of anti-imperialist Marxism, which includes so many figures. You know, you reference Rodney. There's so many people that we need to continue to learn from in order to build movements and drive in the right direction.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I'd like to just read, because as I was reading this book, I'm writing this other paper. You know, you can't just drop in block quotes in papers. It's not a good practice. I try to avoid that, try to paraphrase as much as I can. But I found these kind of series of delegations that American Indian people went on in the late 70s. They went to places like the Soviet Union, to Vietnam, to Iraq, to all kinds of different parts of the world as part of this international project. And I found this really great account of Marie Sanchez, who was a Northern Cheyenne tribal judge from Lane Deer, Montana, who visited Vietnam in December of 1977 with a peace delegation. And just her descriptions, and I'll just read a couple paragraphs. She writes, the main concern in the villages, she went to these kind of remote villages, is education and increasing knowledge. They have their own maternity wards, doctors, and pharmacists. They practice indigenous and herbal medicine. A people's council governs the village following the socialist law. We went to Ho Chi Minh City, formerly Saigon. They had an evening performance by rehabilitated drug addicts. There were many bomb craters. During occupation, there was a lot of venereal disease, prostitution, and drug addiction. The whole economy had depended on foreign supplies. They are mending the wounds of war. We were told about the American soldiers who bragged they had 150 years of fighting experience against Indians. The United States bombed for 20 consecutive days from August 21st, 1966. And one of the most interesting experiences for me was a visit to the Commission of Minorities. There are 61 nationalities in Vietnam, each with their own language. Though the Vietnamese and their minorities considered their nation as one, each culture is highly respected. And in conclusion, she says, in Vietnam, the people are masters of their country. The law is to protect the people. In the United States, we are always trying to sue the government and force it to recognize our rights. In Vietnam, the people are their own judges. And this, to me, like, for somebody who experienced a little bit of solidarity from Venezuela, that went a long way in terms of them providing heating assistance to our reservations in the late 20-aughts. I didn't know anything about Venezuela or the Bolivarian Project, and when I went there, it radically shifted. There's only so many books you can read, right? Theory comes from struggle. And this piece here, it shows you, like, this account and this eyewitness testimony from a tribal judge, who's ostensibly somebody who's like with the system, very, not a radical by any means, and just completely blown away by this project, but understanding how the United States had tried to destroy it and connecting it to her own history. Like, that to me, like, I've read so many books in my life, but that just this testimony alone tells me enough that I need to know. Their primary project was education, as you said. And I think Losurdo even talks about them sending, their students to the Western universities to learn medicine, to learn, these very highly technical skills to bring back to build, the nation. It wasn't just this burn it to the ground mentality, because as this description shows, there were still bomb craters, as they were like building this society from the rubble. And I think about this and I'm like, and I want to get your thoughts on this kind of conclusion that he has, but because the title of the book is Western Marxism, how it was born, how it died, and how it can be reborn. Where does it actually go from here?
It's a good question because, as you know from having read the book, he doesn't lay out an expansive program. He basically alludes to the need for a rejuvenation of the anti-colonial Marxist orientation that carries through the book as a whole. Because in a certain sense, as I mentioned briefly, the criticism of Western Marxism, there's different ways of doing criticism. Some people engage in criticism for the sake of criticism. Losurdo's not doing that. He's a critic of the Western Marxist orientation because he knows what the positive project is, and he sees them as an impediment to that. And so in many ways, I see the conclusion to the book, it's almost Hegelian in a certain sense. It's the result of the book is, well, look at the whole framing of this book. This is what we need more of, is an understanding that the anti-colonial Marxist tradition has not been recognized and has been perverted within the kind of Western Marxist tradition. I do think, though, kind of expanding beyond Losurdo's work per se, at least within this individual book, is that if we're serious about rejuvenating an anti-colonial and anti-imperialist Marxist orientation in the contemporary world, this could lead to, a whole conversation that would be 3 more podcasts, but just 2 elements to consider. One is that I do think it's clearly the case that at the macro level, ideologies are driven by socioeconomic forces. And given that we are in a world in which the leading imperialist power since World War II, the United States, has surpassed its moment of greatest ascent. It's not going to disappear tomorrow. There's a very strong military. It's a powerful force in the world, but we're no longer in the phase of imperialist ascension. We're in a phase that's complicated of imperialist decline, and things are unraveling in a way that could be quickened very, very easily, depending on various crises that emerge. There's the ongoing crisis of capitalist accumulation. There's the inability to win the war, the proxy war against Russia, which we saw. There's a military kind of lashing out in various ways. But we're experiencing, and this even just in my own lifetime, that American power is on the decline in a way that it wasn't when it was the 1990s, for instance. That means that the socioeconomic system frees space up for, I think, greater ideological work on the anti-imperialist front, while at the same time, due to the sharpening of global contradictions with the rise of the multipolar world, and in particular China as one of the prominent leaders in the multipolar world, that sharpening of contradictions also plays in our disfavor, if you will, because it also leads to, as I think is very clear within the imperial core, other forms of radicalization, namely right-wing forms of radicalization and the very prominent rise of fascism across the imperial core and in the capitalist client states and satellite states of the imperial core. And so that's at least at the level of the kind of socioeconomic forces. But the other thing that I wanted to mention was that if you look at the way in which Western Marxism has imposed itself, it's really imposed itself through the imperial theory industry. This isn't just one individual writing, bad book and then it being picked up by a few intellectuals. There's an entire industry that is driving this type of orientation. And so if we want to be serious about fighting the intellectual world war, then we need to build more power collectively, and we need institutional power. We need red media. We need platforms for alternative education. We need our own publishing houses, our own journals, our own conferences. We need everything that the capitalist ruling class makes available to those who are our class enemies. But very much like Radio Rebelde, which Che and Fidel put together in the jungle in Cuba in order to fight against the imperial information and propaganda being put out by the United States. We're going to have to do this as scrappy rebels who are underfunded, under-resourced, and therefore there's going to be a lot of labor of love, a lot of collective labor that goes into that particular project. But it is, in my opinion, the single most important, at least intellectual project in the contemporary moment, because that class struggle in theory is directly embedded in, learns from, related to, dialectically enmeshed with in many ways, the real class struggle, which is the class struggle for an anti-imperialist world. And that's the struggle that we need to not only fight, but we need to be smart enough to win that war if there's going to be a future for humanity and most likely for the overwhelming majority of the planet, because the road that capitalism has put us on is one of potential human and ecological annihilation of the worst possible sort. So the last thing that I'll say is the stakes of class struggle, global class struggle, arguably have never been higher in the history of humanity. Therefore, it really behooves us to get these issues sorted out and figure out how we can put our differences aside, our sectarianism aside, figure out ways of working together in order to push things in the right direction before it's too late.
We're going to have to clip that and run that as a promo for Red Media.
For Red Media?
This is exactly what...
I hope you didn't mind the shout out.
No, that's exactly what, because we are truthfully like membership funded. We don't get like, I'll just be honest, because at this point it doesn't matter. Like we've applied for some grants, but we don't get them because of our position, and they, we're being targeted. Like we're not unique by any means in terms of, left media. Like, I think of like Electronic Intifada, Breakthrough News, other places. They are just like getting targeted, and there's so much backlash in this moment, and it is true. I think that there is a loss of confidence in corporate mainstream narratives and books and the publishing industry, but that doesn't, like you said, it's like the consequences of a multipolar world doesn't mean that it's like necessarily a great thing. It's not like people are turning to these left outlets and progressive outlets and like that's their sole source of news. It also means that the right is moving in, whether it's on the multipolar world front in terms of getting power in these client states or these semi-colonies of the US, or in the media sphere that, the right-wing media is saturated, and like the kind of alternative media sphere, and our biggest kind of enemy in that on that front is not the right-wingers themselves at this point. It's actually been the liberal establishment that has been lopping off this kind of radical. I mean, we can see this in people are like, when Trump comes to power, he's been elected, we're going to have all of this state repression. It's like, have you seen what has happened on college campuses? These are not right-wing ideologues running these universities. Maybe some of their funders are, but the actual administrators are not. They're liberals. They are the ones who are the shock troops of this kind of fascist right wing at the end of the day. But I guess, in terms of this book, and like, I was thinking about, Brett Clark. I met him in Utah. He grew up in a Rapid City. I don't know if he's listening. Shout out to Brett. He grew up in Rapid City, South Dakota. He's a white kid, and we kind of connected because he was part of the punk scene, and the punk scene in South Dakota. It's like, you have to remember, like, South Dakota is just like less than 1 million people. I think there was like 650,000 people who live there. So everybody knows each other. But it was just kind of cool because it's, he came from a certain class position and, rose through the ranks, much in a similar way that you did in terms of your class background. But it's not rewarded to speak from a class position. And in fact, if you publish in places like, a class position such as ours, I should say, if you speak from the ruling class position, it's highly rewarded. But if you look at like even a publication like Monthly Review, which I just find like so fascinating. I was talking to Brett and he was like, our highest readership is the demographic of like 18 to 35 year olds. And it's like, that's so fascinating because people kind of write it off as this kind of like old school, unreconstructed Marxist, blah, 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 Cold War relic. But it's like, if you read, I've read John Bellamy Foster. I've read, a lot of the Barn and Sweezy theories of imperialism. I read, Emma Clark Rabal's stuff that was published through them. And they have such a great publishing house. Now they're publishing a lot of Chinese academics where you kind of get that perspective. This is me giving a shout out to them, but that I would say that would be kind of one kind of cultural front that we could work on in terms of promoting the journal. And I get their MR online thing where they kind of collate articles on the left, and that's something that I've kind of subscribe to. But I would like to ask you too, I don't know if you're working with them on any other of Losurdo's books or publications, or even you talked about your trilogy that's coming out, but if there's anything that like you want to kind of like promote or uplift that our viewers and listeners might want to check out or might be interested in, I'd love to hear if you have any shout outs.
Yeah, no, I share your enthusiasm for the longstanding history of Monthly Review and all of the important work that they've been doing and continue to do. And people should support them in any way, shape or form. I do have a trilogy that's coming out with Monthly Review, and then I have a book that I co-authored. I actually have a copy right here with Émeric Monville. It's in French, called The Requiem for French Theory. And it's coming out in English with Monthly Review Press. And it's a critique of French theory, but it's also much more expansive than that. Émeric is actually the leading French translator of Losurdo. And so we engage with the real question at stake here, right? There are the kind of academic and intellectual questions, but what I take it's at stake for both of us is the broader issues of class struggle. The state of the left in the imperial core, the rise of the multipolar world, the risks of fascism. And so we get into a lot of that in the dialogue. Maybe the only other thing that I'll mention is, so I am involved with a number of other people in writing an educational nonprofit called the Critical Theory Workshop. And we do regular webinars. We have a summer school. And actually, Nick, you've been on the list for years as a potential invited speaker. So we should talk about that off camera because we'd love to have you involved directly. But we also have a new book series called AIM, Anti-Imperialist Marxism. That is an Iskra imprint. I'm involved with the World Marxism Review, and we're also working on other kind of collective projects. So these are the types of things that it's great to have kind of overlapping projects in various ways, but then if we can collectively consolidate them and build more power in this direction, I think it's incredibly important. So I also really just appreciate all the work that you've done, because as you've demonstrated through your own kind of intellectual and theoretical practice, it's not just about writing great books, which you've done. It's not just about being a prominent intellectual and taking public positions, which you've done, but it's also about building collective power by having media platforms and working in a collective and collaborative manner so that the struggle is advanced not just through individual means, but through collective means. And I think that that's one of the single most important things that people can do as intellectuals, is have a collective theoretical practice and a collaborative one. And so kudos to you, and let's keep up this type of work because it's really important.
Well, thanks so much, Gabriel. We'd love to have you on again once you finish that massive trilogy.
Well, one of them's done, is in press. So I'm glad that one's going to be out next year.
Awesome.
And the other two will be out in due time.